Excuse me, but this is my seat. Edward. Harrison barked, his face flushed as he loomed over Alicia Monroe. The black woman CEO sat frozen in 2A, her hand gripping the armrest nails pressing into the leather, while dozens of eyes turned toward her.
This is my seat.
Harrison's voice grew sharper, slicing
please
through the
calm down.
cabin. Some people just don't belong up here.
This is my seat.
Gasps rippled across business class.
Sir, please calm down.
Alicia's calm gaze never faltered, but the faintest smile tugged at her lips, because the man demanding her removal had no idea whose seat he was trying to steal. Would you have spoken up? Share this if you believe.
Please step aside.
Silence is never an option. Flight 912 from New York to London was already buzzing with the quiet hum of tired business travelers and families ready for the overnight journey.
I'm not going anywhere.
The muted glow of the cabin lights gave first class a polished calm, a space where the elite tucked themselves into lie-flat seats with glasses of champagne. At 2A, a woman in an emerald green suit jacket shifted slightly, crossing her legs as she opened a leather-bound notebook. Her name was Alicia Monroe, a 45-year-old executive with the kind of poise that seemed unshakable. Her diamond-studded watch glimmered as she made a quick note in the margin of a document. Then she placed the pen back with deliberate care. Every detail about her presence, the crisp tailoring, the calm posture, the precise movements, spoke of discipline and power. But at that moment, no one else in the cabin knew who she really was. A sharp voice broke the calm. "Excuse me. I think you're in my seat." A man's hand slapped against the headrest, startling the quiet around her. Alicia looked up slowly. The man looming above her was already flushed, his breath uneven despite the cool air of the cabin. Edward Ted Harrison, mid-50s with thinning blonde hair and a polo shirt that bore sweat stains along the collar, towered over her. He clutched a crumpled boarding pass in his right hand and waved it at her like proof of ownership. His eyes darted around the cabin, searching for witnesses. "This is 2A. I paid for this seat months ago." Alicia held his gaze but said nothing. She didn't flinch, didn't rush to defend herself. The silence carried a weight heavier than words, and for a moment it unsettled him. Passengers nearby began to glance over, sensing the friction. Some shifted uncomfortably, others leaned in with curiosity. The atmosphere turned tense in an instant, like static in the air before a storm. Have you ever been so underestimated that your silence became your most powerful weapon? That was Alicia's stance now, still composed, commanding without a sound. Ted's voice grew louder, sharp enough to slice through the hushed conversations around them. "Look, lady, I don't know who you borrowed that outfit from, but you're sitting in my seat. First class isn't for just anyone you know." The words hung heavy, dripping with condescension. He adjusted his stance, leaning closer, using his height as a weapon. His smirk was practiced the smug expression of a man who was used to being obeyed. The tension deepened, an uncomfortable charge filling the air. A woman in the next seat, Priya Patel, a 30-year-old tech entrepreneur, tapping away on her laptop, froze. Her dark eyes lifted from her screen, catching the man's tone. Something about it felt wrong, too familiar, too dismissive. She reached instinctively for her phone. Priya had seen enough viral clips to recognize where this was heading. Within seconds, her camera was rolling her Instagram Live counter beginning at 0, then creeping upwards. No problem here, Ted barked without looking at her. Just someone who doesn't understand how seating works. Alicia remained perfectly still. Her manicured hand stayed resting on the armrest, her other hand loosely holding her notebook. Not once did her eyes flicker with fear or uncertainty. Instead, she studied him the way a chess player studies an opponent 3 moves away from checkmate. Around them, whispers were rising. A couple in row 3 leaned closer together, murmuring. A retired Navy veteran named James O'Connor, sitting in 4C, crossed his arms and narrowed his eyes at the confrontation. He'd seen plenty of power struggles in his life, and something about this one made his jaw tighten. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain's voice crackled through the overhead speaker. "We have a minor delay before departure. Please remain seated." The announcement only fed Ted's confidence. He gestured broadly toward Alicia, his voice dripping with irritation. "See, you're holding up the whole flight." A flight attendant appeared, her smile thin and polite, but her eyes strained. Margaret Doyle, a seasoned senior attendant in her early 50s, looked from Ted to Alicia, her gaze landing first on the woman in emerald. "Is there a seating issue here?" she asked, though. The way her voice tilted suggested she already suspected who was at fault. Ted seized the opportunity. "Yes, there is. This woman is in the wrong seat. I need you to sort this out." He pushed his boarding pass forward, the paper wrinkled from his sweaty grip. Alicia reached into her leather tote, her movements graceful, unhurried. She withdrew her boarding pass and extended it to Margaret without a word. The attendant's eyes flicked across the document. For a moment, confusion passed over her face. "Ma'am, this shows 2A, she said softly, almost uncertainly. Ted snapped back immediately. "That's impossible. Let me see that." But Alicia had already slid the pass back into her bag, her calmness irritating him further. Priya's live stream counter ticked upward. 20 people watching. 50. Comments began appearing, viewers typing furiously as they sensed the unfolding drama. Some cheered Alicia's composure. Others guessed what might happen next. James O'Connor shifted in his seat, his eyes fixed on Ted, who was now leaning even closer, his voice carrying over the rows. "I don't care what she thinks she has. This is my seat. People like her don't belong in this cabin." The words struck like a slap. A ripple of discomfort spread through the cabin. Alicia's jaw tightened ever so slightly, the only crack in her serenity. But still, she didn't speak. She didn't need to. The silence, the poise, the deliberate stillness, it was beginning to turn the tide. Passengers were watching recording, whispering their discomfort, transforming into awareness. Priya's live stream had already reached 100 viewers and climbing fast. The boarding doors remained open, and outside ground staff moved with increasing urgency. The digital departure board above the jetway blinked. Departure delayed 12 minutes. In seat 4C, James leaned forward, muttering to the man beside him. "I've seen this before. Some folks don't think everyone deserves the same respect." His words weren't loud, but they carried just enough to add weight to the growing awareness. Ted was relentless. He jabbed a finger toward Alicia, his voice booming. "You're making this harder than it needs to be. Just move. Don't embarrass yourself." His arrogance filled the space, but the effect was shifting. Phones were out everywhere now. Priya's viewers hit 200. Several other passengers had joined in, discreetly recording from different angles, The tension was no longer just between two people. It was an entire cabin caught in a moment of judgment, deciding silently which side they were on. Alicia adjusted the lapel of her jacket and looked at him steadily, her calm more powerful than his fury. Around her, the quiet was becoming louder than his shouting. It was the silence of witnesses, the silence of people realizing they were part of something bigger than a seat dispute. And it was the silence of a woman who knew exactly who she was, even if no one else in the cabin did yet. The stage was set. The air had changed. Something was about to happen that would ground not just the flight, but the assumptions of everyone watching. The cabin of Flight 912 felt smaller now, the air thick with a tension that grew heavier by the second. Edward Harrison's voice rose again, sharper, louder, feeding on his own indignation. "This is ridiculous," he declared, waving his boarding pass like a weapon. "I paid for this seat. I was here first. I'm not about to be shoved aside because someone doesn't know how to read their ticket." His words carried reaching all the way to row 6, where curious faces began peering down the aisle. Alicia Monroe did not move. Her emerald jacket caught the low light as she sat with impeccable stillness, her notebook still resting neatly on her lap. Her silence was not weakness. It was calculated, deliberate. She let him rant, let his arrogance echo through the cabin, while she remained composed, a contrast so stark it unsettled even those who weren't sure what to believe. Some passengers avoided her eyes, while others stared openly, waiting for the moment she would break. But she did not. Margaret Doyle, the senior flight attendant, tried again to intervene. "Sir, please," she said, with professional calm, though the strain in her voice betrayed her unease. "We'll sort this out quickly. There's no need to raise your voice." Edward turned to her, pointing at Alicia with an accusatory finger. "She's the one causing the problem. I've been patient long enough. Get her out of my seat before we miss our departure window." Margaret hesitated, torn between the confident bluster of the red-faced man and the serene silence of the woman he targeted. Years of working in first class had conditioned her instincts, and too often those instincts favored passengers who looked like Edward Harrison. She glanced at Alicia, her voice dropping. "Ma'am, would you mind stepping aside for a moment while we sort this out?" Gasps rippled through the nearby rows. Alicia finally looked up from her lap, her gaze unwavering. Her voice, when it came, was soft, controlled, yet laced with steel. "I'm comfortable here." It was the first time she had spoken since the confrontation began, and the effect was immediate. Heads turned. Priya Patel's live stream counter surged. The chat window on her screen exploded with comments. "She's so calm. This feels wrong. Is anyone else uncomfortable with the way they're treating her?" Viewers were already choosing sides, and the tide was beginning to turn. Edward bristled. Her quiet defiance only inflamed him further. "You're holding up the entire flight for no reason," he snapped. "Do you understand how much my time is worth? I have a critical meeting in London. I don't have time for this nonsense." He shifted closer, invading her space, his shadow stretching across her seat. "Some people just don't know their place." The words hung in the air like a blade. For a moment, the cabin seemed to freeze. Alicia's jaw tightened, the only visible sign that his comment had struck where he intended. Priya's phone caught it all, the audio clear, the chat filling instantly with outrage. "Did he just say that this is disgusting? Keep recording. Priya angled her phone slightly, ensuring both their faces were visible. Her viewers shot past 300. James O'Connor, the Navy veteran in 4C, leaned forward now, his voice steady but firm. Enough, he said, not loud, but with a weight that drew attention. She was seated when I boarded. She's not the problem here. Edward shot him a glare. Stay out of it. This doesn't concern you. James didn't flinch. It concerns all of us when someone's treated unfairly. His presence, his quiet authority, added a new dimension to the standoff. Other passengers shifted, emboldened by his words. The crowd was no longer just watching. They were taking sides. At the front of the cabin, the curtain swished aside. A young attendant, Diego Morales, appeared clutching a tablet and looking nervous. He was new, barely 6 months on the job, and his eyes darted between Edward's flushed face and Alicia's composed figure. "What's going on here?" he asked, though his voice wavered. Margaret quickly filled him in, her words leaning toward Edward's version of events. Diego's uncertainty was obvious, his body language betraying the weight of protocol versus conscience. Alicia studied him quietly, her gaze steady, almost as though she were measuring him, testing his response. The captain himself appeared next, striding down the aisle with the kind of presence that silenced chatter. Captain Reynolds was a veteran of 3 decades in the cockpit, but his patience for disruptions was thin. He stopped beside Margaret, listening quickly as she summarized. His eyes flicked from Edward, sweating and agitated, to Alicia, calm and still. The subtle bias was immediate. "Ma'am," he said, addressing Alicia with forced politeness, "I'll need you to step off the plane while we sort this out at the gate." Edward's smirk widened the corners of his mouth, twitching in satisfaction. He had won, and he knew it. Alicia stood slowly, every movement precise, deliberate. The emerald fabric of her jacket caught the light as she reached for her tote bag, but she didn't move toward the aisle. She simply stood, briefcase in hand, her presence commanding attention. Priya's stream surged past 600 viewers' comments, flying faster than she could read them. "Don't let them kick her off. This feels racist. Keep filming." Phones were out everywhere now. Passengers discreetly, or not so discreetly, recording the unfolding scene from multiple angles. Edward, drunk on his perceived victory, pushed further. "Finally. Maybe now we can get this flight moving. Honestly, I don't know what she thought she was doing, but first class isn't for everyone." His words landed like poison, and the silence that followed was louder than any outburst. Even Margaret flinched, her practiced composure cracking. James muttered, his voice carrying just enough. "This is shameful." The digital board at the front of the cabin blinked again. Departure delayed 9 minutes. Every passing second tightened the coil of tension. Passengers in economy were peering through the curtain, now whispering to each other, trying to catch glimpses of the scene. Margaret's radio crackled at her hip. The supervisor at the gate wanted updates. The situation was no longer a quiet dispute. It was a spectacle, and the eyes of 60 passengers and now hundreds of live stream viewers were fixed on it. Priya whispered into her phone for her audience. He just told her she doesn't belong here. Everyone heard it. This is happening right now on Flight 912. Her counter ticked upward again. 800 viewers. 900. 1,000. Comments flooded in posts this everywhere. Tag the airline. This man is done. The digital world outside the plane was already closing in, though Edward had no idea. Alicia's silence stretched, becoming unbearable for those around her. She held her ground eyes steady on the captain, who shifted uncomfortably under her gaze. Diego shifted too, his hand tightening around his tablet as if wrestling with the weight of protocol and morality. Margaret rubbed her temple, her confidence unraveling. Edward's grin faltered slightly as the balance in the room began to change. He had wanted this to be a simple victory, but it was becoming something else, something bigger than he had anticipated. The stage was set. The flight was delayed. The passengers restless, the world outside, watching through 1,000 screens. Power had been tested, and though Edward believed he held it, there was a growing sense that the truth was about to shift. The silence that Alicia carried was no longer passive. It was a force waiting to strike, and every person in that cabin could feel it. The silence in the cabin deepened until even the low hum of the air conditioning seemed muted. Every passenger felt suspended in a moment that could tilt either way toward humiliation or toward justice. Alicia Monroe stood, tall briefcase still in hand. Her eyes locked on Captain Reynolds, who avoided her gaze and shifted his weight uncomfortably. Edward Harrison leaned back slightly in his seat, smirking as if savoring the inevitable victory. "Well," he said, his voice oily with satisfaction. "Are we done here? Can we finally get this plane off the ground?" Alicia's lips curved into the faintest smile, sharp and deliberate. For the first time since the confrontation began, she took control of the silence. Her voice cut cleanly through the tension, calm but commanding. "Before you call security," she said evenly, "I think you should see something." With that, she placed her briefcase on the seat beside her and snapped it open. Every eye followed the simple movement, the sound of metal clasps echoing like a gavel strike. Edward craned his neck, irritation flickering into curiosity. What could she possibly have that mattered? A ticket stub? A receipt? Some desperate attempt to cling to dignity, Alicia withdrew a single folder. It was sleek, understated, but the crisp official seal stamped across its cover silenced the whispers immediately. She handed it directly to Captain Reynolds, her gaze steady. "Read it." The captain hesitated, glancing at Edward as if for permission. Then reluctantly, he opened the folder. His eyes scanned the first page. The color drained from his face. His posture stiffened. The calm authority he carried into the cabin just minutes earlier vanished, replaced by shock. His lips moved, but no words came. Margaret Doyle leaned over his shoulder to glimpse the contents. Her breath caught audibly. "Oh my God!" What Edward demanded, leaning forward, frustrated at being excluded. "What is it? What's she showing you?" Captain Reynolds closed the folder slowly, his hands trembling ever so slightly. He looked at Alicia the way a soldier might look at a decorated general unexpectedly in disguise. "Ms. Monroe," he whispered, his tone transformed. "I had no idea." The shift in his voice rippled through the cabin. Margaret's eyes were wide, her practiced professionalism crumbling. Diego Morales froze, his tablet clutched tightly against his chest. Priya Patel angled her phone to catch every reaction, her live stream chat exploding. Something big just happened. Look at the captain's face. What did she show him? Edward's smirk, faltered, irritation mounting. This is ridiculous. What are you all gawking at? She's just bluffing. Some piece of paper isn't going to change the fact that she's in my seat. Alicia returned the folder to her briefcase with unhurried precision. Then she straightened her voice, carrying effortlessly to every corner of the cabin. My name is Alicia Monroe. I am the Chief Executive Officer of Horizon Global Holdings. The cabin gasped as if struck by a single force. Horizon Global, a name that resonated instantly. A multinational powerhouse, its fingers in technology finance, and most relevant of all, aviation. Several passengers instinctively reached for their phones, searching her name. The results lit up screens across the cabin. News articles, magazine covers, a Forbes profile naming her one of the most influential women in America. Edward blinked, his face flushing. That doesn't mean anything, he sputtered, clinging to the last threads of denial. So what if you're some executive? You still don't belong in my seat. Alicia tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing with deliberate calm. Horizon Global Holdings, she said, clearly owns a controlling stake in Atlantic Air. The words hit like thunder. For a beat, the cabin was silent, then gasps, whispers, and the furious tapping of thumbs filled the air. Priya's live stream counter soared past 3,000 viewers. Her audience was already typing frantically. She owns the airline. This man picked the wrong fight. This is legendary. Edward's jaw slackened. No, that's impossible, he stammered. You can't. But Captain Reynolds knew the truth. He snapped to attention, his entire demeanor transformed. Ms. Monroe, he said, his voice now weighted with deference. On behalf of the crew, I deeply apologize for what just happened. Margaret Doyle nodded, pale and shaken. We never would have. Wouldn't you? Alicia interrupted softly, her voice cutting without raising. If you had known who I was, you would have treated me differently. That's the problem. The truth in her words hung heavier than any revelation of wealth or power. Passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, recognizing the uncomfortable reality of what they had just witnessed. Priya's chat filled with messages that hit hard. She's right. This is exactly how bias works. Edward was sputtering now, desperate. She's lying. She has to be lying. This is some stunt. But his voice wavered. The earlier confidence drained away. Alicia calmly reached for her phone, unlocked it with a swipe, and held up the screen. Her contacts list glowed under the cabin lights. CEO Atlantic Air, CFO Atlantic Air, COO Atlantic Air. The proof was undeniable. Would you like me to call any of them? She asked lightly, almost conversationally. Edward's mouth opened, then closed. He had no words left. His face cycled through disbelief, anger, and finally dawning horror. Around him, passengers recorded every second, some murmuring in awe, others shaking their heads in disbelief at the audacity he had displayed. Alicia slid her phone back into her jacket pocket. You assumed I didn't belong here, she said to Edward, her tone steady but sharp. You raised your voice. You tried to have me removed from a seat on an airline I own. The captain lowered his head, shame evident in every line of his posture. Margaret looked as though she might cry. Diego shifted uncomfortably, the reality of his silence weighing heavy. James O'Connor, the veteran, met Alicia's gaze and gave the slightest nod of respect. The cabin had transformed. Moments ago, Alicia had been treated like an intruder. Now she commanded the space entirely, her presence undeniable. The revelation was not just about her identity. It was about the mirror it held up to everyone in that cabin, their assumptions, their biases, their willingness to side with the loudest voice rather than the calmest truth. Edward, broken, now tried one last time. I didn't mean. You meant exactly what you said, Alicia interrupted. And now the world has seen it. She gestured toward Priya, whose live stream had surged past 5,000 viewers. Every word, every action has been documented. The smirk was gone. The arrogance had drained. Edward Harrison sat in seat 3B, pale and silent, as Alicia Munro lowered herself back into 3A, crossing her legs with deliberate grace. She opened her notebook as if reclaiming her space was as effortless as turning a page. The plane had not moved an inch. The flight was still delayed. But everything had shifted. The revelation was complete. And there was no going back. The weight of silence returned to the cabin, but now it carried a different charge. Every passenger understood they were witnessing something irreversible, and every phone recording ensured that the story would live beyond this plane. Alicia Munro closed her notebook slowly, her voice calm yet cutting as she addressed Captain Reynolds. Now that we've established who I am, let's discuss what comes next. The captain nodded quickly, his earlier authority replaced with visible unease. Yes, Ms. Munro, whatever you need. Don't apologize to me, she interrupted. Her gaze swept across the crew, Margaret Doyle still trembling, Diego Morales staring at the floor, the captain shrinking under her words. Apologies are meaningless unless they're followed by change. What I want to know is how you intend to correct this pattern, because this is not the first time I've seen it, and unless something changes, it won't be the last. Margaret's lip quivered. I never meant to. Intent, Alicia said evenly, is irrelevant. What matters is impact. The impact of your actions was clear. You immediately sided with the man shouting over me instead of the woman sitting quietly with her boarding pass. That's what passengers of color experience every single day. And tonight, you made it visible to the world. Priya's livestream surged past 12,000 viewers' comments flying across her screen. She's speaking truth. This is history in the making. Accountability in real time. Alicia turned her attention back to Edward Harrison, whose face had gone chalk white. He had once filled the cabin with arrogance, but now he sat hunched, his bravado collapsing. And you, she said, her words measured but merciless. You assumed that because of my skin, my place in this seat was less valid than yours. You weaponized your voice, your size, your entitlement. You tried to remove me from a flight I not only paid for, but own. You created a hostile environment, delayed this flight, and exposed your prejudice to thousands of witnesses. Edward's lips trembled. Please, he whispered. I made a mistake. I didn't know. That's exactly the point, Alicia cut in. You didn't need to know who I was to treat me with basic respect. And yet, here we are. She gestured toward Priya's phone, still streaming, still capturing every moment. You've humiliated yourself, yes, but more importantly, you've revealed a problem much larger than yourself. Passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some bowing their heads, others looking at Alicia with newfound respect. James O'Connor, the veteran who had once muttered agreement with Edward, now cleared his throat. She's right, he said quietly. but loud enough for those around him to hear. We were quick to believe the wrong person. The acknowledgement hung heavy in the air. Edward pressed a hand to his forehead, his voice cracking. Please, I can't lose everything over this. Alicia regarded him coolly. You were willing to make me lose my dignity, my place, my voice, all because you assumed I didn't belong. And now that you're concerned about losing your reputation. That's privilege, Mr. Harrison. And tonight it ends. Captain Reynolds shifted nervously. Ms. Monroe, what do you want us to do? Alicia stood commanding the aisle with the authority of someone who no longer needed to justify her presence. What I want, she said firmly, is accountability. Mr. Harrison will be escorted off this aircraft upon landing. He will not fly Atlantic Air again, and his behavior will be reported to federal authorities as harassment of another passenger. The captain swallowed hard but nodded. Yes, ma'am. Margaret looked stricken. And us, Alicia replied, her tone softening only slightly, will undergo immediate retraining. But more than that, you'll learn to question the assumptions you make. Because tonight, your failure wasn't procedural. It was human. Margaret nodded tearfully. Diego raised his hand, as if in a classroom, his voice quiet but steady. Ms. Monroe, I should have said something. I watched it happen, and I stayed silent. That was wrong. Alicia's eyes lingered on him. Yes, Diego. Silence in the face of injustice is complicity, but recognizing that truth is the first step to changing it. Don't forget this moment. Use it. Priya lowered her phone slightly, her voice thick with emotion as she spoke to the cabin. Everyone out there is watching this right now. Thousands of people. They've seen what happened. But more importantly, they're seeing how it's being confronted. She turned back to Alicia. You've changed something tonight. Alicia inclined her head, the faintest glimmer of a smile tugging at her lips. This isn't about me. It's about all of us choosing to do better. About proving that justice isn't just an abstract word, it's action, consequences, transformation. The passengers sat in hushed stillness, their earlier curiosity now replaced with reflection. The smirks, the whispers, the biases all had been dismantled by the clarity of truth. Edward Harrison slumped in his seat, silent at last, the reality of consequence bearing down on him. The plane, though still motionless on the tarmac, felt like it had already traveled miles. Something irreversible had shifted in that cabin. Justice had been spoken aloud, and with it came the undeniable weight of consequence. Months later, the ripple effects of that night in the sky had transformed into a wave that reshaped not only Atlantic Air, but the airline industry itself. Alicia Monroe walked through the glass atrium of Atlantic's New York headquarters, her heels clicking against the polished floor. The walls now bore posters of the company's new initiative, Dignity in Flight. The slogan was simple, but powerful. Respect has no class. Inside the boardroom, Sarah Martinez, the newly appointed Vice President of Diversity and Inclusion, presented the quarterly report. Discrimination complaints are down 78% since the implementation of our new policies, she said with quiet pride. Customer satisfaction is at its highest in a decade, and our employee training program, mandatory for every single frontline worker, has achieved 99% completion. Alicia nodded, flipping through the data. She didn't need the numbers to know the shift was real. She had seen it herself on her monthly unannounced flights. No longer did she witness the reflexive suspicion, the subtle exclusions. The culture was changing, not because of her name, but because the system itself was being restructured. What about industry influence? Alicia asked, her voice carrying across the table. Sarah smiled. Delta, American United, and Southwest have all adopted versions of our Dignity in Flight program. They're citing us as the model. And last week, the Civil Rights Coalition named Atlantic the most inclusive airline in North America. Around the table, executives exchanged glances. This was more than a corporate success. It was a cultural shift. Yet Alicia's thoughts drifted back to that cabin months before. To Margaret Doyle's trembling voice, to Diego Morales's quiet admission to James O'Connor's reluctant awakening, to Priya Patel's phone broadcasting truth into the world. That night had been the catalyst. But the transformation required more than one confrontation. It required commitment. Priya herself had taken the experience and built something of her own. Her live stream, once spontaneous, had become a platform for social justice storytelling. With millions of followers, she now traveled across the country, speaking about the power of documentation and the responsibility of bearing witness. She often credited Alicia, but Alicia knew the truth. Priya had always carried that courage inside her. Even Edward Harrison's life had changed. His public disgrace had cost him his career, his reputation, and nearly everything he clung to. But in the aftermath, stripped of excuses, he had begun the work of reckoning. He spoke at universities, at corporate workshops, about unconscious bias and privilege, not as an expert, but as a cautionary tale. And while many doubted his sincerity, Alicia believed that transformation, however imperfect, was still worth acknowledging. For Alicia, the greatest impact came not from headlines or accolades, but from the letters she received, from young Black professionals who no longer feared being judged for where they sat on an airplane, from parents who told her their children saw her story and believed perhaps for the first time that they belonged anywhere, from allies who realized their silence had power, and that power could be redirected toward justice. She stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of the boardroom, looking down at the runways where planes lifted into the sky. The airport pulsed with movement, thousands of lives intersecting in fleeting moments. Somewhere out there, another confrontation was waiting to happen. Another injustice was ready to surface. And someone else, perhaps quiet, perhaps unassuming, would face the choice to speak up or stay silent. Alicia closed her folder, her voice steady as she addressed the board. This isn't the end of the work. Transformation isn't a destination. It's a process. What happened that night was never just about one man or one seat or even one airline. It was about the structures that shape how we see each other. Our responsibility is to keep dismantling those structures piece by piece until dignity is the default, not the exception. Outside, a plane roared into the clouds, climbing higher, stronger, steadier. Alicia watched it disappear into the blue and allowed herself the smallest smile. She knew the work wasn't finished, but she also knew this one act of resistance, one refusal to be moved, had already shifted the ground beneath an entire industry. And that was only the beginning. Alicia Monroe's story began with a stolen seat, but it became so much more than a dispute on a plane. What started as humiliation and disbelief grew into a powerful confrontation that revealed not only who she was, but also the hidden biases that still exist in everyday spaces. In that cabin, Edward Harrison believed his stature and privilege gave him the right to dismiss her, to erase her presence, to question her very belonging. Yet Alicia's quiet strength turned that moment of injustice into a reckoning for him, for the crew, and for an entire industry. The flight was grounded, but so were old assumptions. Out of one confrontation came sweeping reforms, cultural change, and a new model for accountability in corporate America. Alicia didn't raise her voice, but she raised the standard. She showed us that courage is not always about shouting the loudest. It can be found in stillness, in refusing to move when others try to push you aside, and in using your position not just to defend yourself, but to transform the system for others. The lesson is clear. Discrimination doesn't always wear a uniform of hate. Sometimes it hides in subtle doubts in who is believed first, in who is asked to leave without question. But when someone stands their ground, when witnesses speak up, when silence is broken, change becomes possible. In our workplaces, our communities, even in the smallest daily interactions, we carry that same choice to look away or to lean in and act. Alicia's refusal to yield her seat reminds us that we all have a seat to claim in the fight for dignity and equality. And when one person takes that stand, countless others find their courage too. If this story moved, you don't let it end here. Subscribe to our channel, share your voice, and help us continue telling the stories that spark change. Together, we can make sure silence never wins.